When Lisa was growing up in Amherst, Massachusetts in the 1960s and 70s, her parents really didn't understand her temperament.
They were very outgoing people, but there was tension because I was not.
Her parents loved to entertain.
And so they always had people coming in and out of the house, which I kind of hated as a little kid. Like, it was frightening to me.
They encouraged her to play outside after school, to hang out in the street with the neighborhood kids. Lisa preferred to stay home and read.
My idea of a dream weekend is maybe I take a short bike ride, but most of the weekend I'm either in the attic or in my room with the door shut reading a book. And this was just unacceptable to them. Like, they really had a problem with it.
She spent a lot of time alone. She was an only child until the age of 9. Her favorite companion, in book form, was Harriet the Spy. Her parents didn't get it.
And that became a refrain as I got older. When I did things that were unfamiliar to them, they would say, "What's wrong with you?"
Dee Gish had a very similar experience. She was growing up around the same time as Lisa, though 300 miles from Amherst, in central Pennsylvania. The rest of her family was mostly healthy, but
I was a sickly child. I had asthma, lots of allergies, made frequent trips to the hospital.
And she didn't look like her parents or sister. They had dark complexions, while she had blonde hair and blue eyes.
There were, neighborhood jokes about me being the mailman's daughter and things like that, which I didn't realize at the time how true that could have been.
It would be decades before Dee and Lisa, separately, discovered the secret that explained why they were so different from their parents, and so similar, it would turn out, to each other. This is episode 4 of The Secrets We Keep, a podcast from NEPM about the stories we don't tell, what they say about our world, and what they do to our minds. I'm Karen Brown. In this episode, what happens when you are the biggest secret in your own life? And what does that revelation put in motion? This podcast episode is about family secrets, so perhaps it's not surprising Lisa didn't want her last name used. As a kid, Lisa wasn't close to her father. She says there was tension after her parents divorced, around things like where she would go to college or who would pay for what.
It was really not until I was married and living in D.C. and working that he and I kind of mended fences.
Lisa and her first husband had a daughter, but the marriage didn't work out. They got a divorce. She moved back to Western Mass, partly to be closer to her mom. Her father had already died. By 2016, she was working as a grant writer for Amherst College and married to her second husband, an academic and historian.
My husband and I were big fans of the Henry Louis Gates show, Finding Your Roots.
You ever heard this story? No.
And we started watching it and we got really addicted to it. And, he's constantly finding ethnic heritage that people didn't know they had.
Lisa and her husband both decided to find out their own heritage, so they bought genetic testing kits and sent in saliva samples. Her husband's results came back as expected, 98% Ashkenazi Jew.
And I get my results back, and they're kind of what I expected. My dad was German on both sides. My mom's English on both sides. But I had all this Irish in there. And I was like,
On the website, there was a box asking if she wanted to see her DNA relatives. She clicked yes.
It spins and spins and spins. There's a little, I'm working kind of spinning thing on your screen. And then the results came up, and the first result was half-brother. And then there's one that says half-sister, and then there's one that says half-brother.
Some of the matches included photos.
So I blew up the first picture, and it was like looking in the mirror. It was really strange. He had very, very similar eyes and brow bones and cheekbones.
The ramifications were dawning on her.
I couldn't breathe for a second. It was just this kind of shock, and it seemed really surreal.
Once she caught her breath, she called her mom and asked straight out, "Did you and Dad use a donor to have me?"
There was this long silence, and she said, "I promised I'd never talk about this."
It's for her mother's privacy that Lisa asked us not to use her last name. Turns out, back in the early 60s, Lisa's parents tried for a baby without success. Medical tests suggested it was because of her father's infertility. Her mother wanted a child, and her father didn't want to adopt. So they went to a fertility clinic in the Philadelphia area, the Ferris Institute, one of the country's first, to pursue artificial insemination.
This was the compromise, but the agreement was that they would never speak of it. And the clinics at the time, in the 60s when I was conceived, the clinics would kind of enable this secret keeping by saying to the parents, they would say, well, we'll mix it, the donor sperm and yours together, and you'll never know.
Of course, that was decades before anyone imagined the secret-busting powers of mail-in genetic testing. Once Lisa got her DNA results, she joined a Facebook group created by some of her half-siblings. And one of them was the woman we met earlier.
I'm Dee Gish. I live in Sharon, Vermont. Currently, I work as an accountant for the Vermont Land Trust.
Remember, Dee grew up in Pennsylvania, where she recalls a basically happy childhood, but with some major stressors. Her mother had to spend a lot of time dealing with Dee's health problems and not focused on her own marriage. Her parents grew apart, and as Dee got older, her own relationship with her father deteriorated.
He was an alcoholic, and looking back, I feel some sense of guilt for that because I think just me being alive could have contributed to his alcoholism.
Dee went through her adolescence without repairing the relationship with her father, and he died when she was a junior in college. That's when her mother sat Dee and her sister down and said she had something to tell them. She and their father had spent 12 years trying to conceive until they decided to go to a sperm bank in Philadelphia, the Ferris Institute.
I do remember my reaction. It was a sense of relief, and that makes so much sense, and now I get it. But being in my early 20s, I was so self-absorbed. I didn't have the maturity to really probe any further.
Dee didn't follow up with any questions, like why didn't they tell the children growing up? How did her father feel about it? How did it affect their marriage?
I had just assumed that my mother and I would have a long time ahead of us to have these conversations when we were both ready.
In the past decade or so, consumer genetic testing companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com have made it easy and cheap to find out our origins. Since then, family skeletons have been busting out of the proverbial closet, often bifurcating lives between before and after. We'll get back to Dee and Lisa's story, but first, let's try to understand why this particular kind of family secret can be so painful.
Thank you so much for letting me come here and giving me like an adventure.
Writer Dani Shapiro is a memoirist and novelist who writes about family secrets. I spoke with her at her Northern Connecticut farmhouse.
Can I make you a oat milk cappuccino? I'm making one for myself.
In the past few years, Shapiro has thought a lot about what people choose to keep from the people they love and how those secrets affect relationships, identities, and well-being, including her own. She wrote about this in her book, Inheritance.
When there is a massive secret being kept, there's some level at which you know it, and like cellularly. And so there was always this feeling that I had of something not adding up.
From the very beginning, when she was a baby, she has memories of her mother's facial expressions.
And my mother's pupils would jiggle. I mean, they just were anxiously jiggling when she looked at me. She was seeing a secret she was keeping. She was seeing something that made her exceedingly uncomfortable, even if she wasn't holding it consciously.
Even before Dani learned anything concrete, she had a sense something was up.
Almost everyone who has had some kinds of, family secret or parental secrets kept from them, they snoop. We snoop.
Because you just have this idea there must be something.
There must be something, yeah.
When her parents would go out for the evening, she'd look through their things.
Go through my mother's office, go through my mother's closets or her locked jewelry drawer or my father's nightstand. And I remember being in her office and finding a document that had her first name and a different last name.
She asked her mom, who admitted to a previous marriage. And then Dani learned through some offhanded comments that her father had been married before and that she had an older half-sister. She began to feel untethered, and it came out in her behavior.
I was sort of unknowable to myself for a long time.
Were you partying a lot?
Oh, I was partying a lot. I dropped out of college. I was so completely not finding my path.
And it was still years before the biggest secret about her life would come out. During that period, she published novels and memoirs about growing up Jewish in a deeply religious family, about her close relationship with her father, who died in a car accident when she was 23, and about her fraught relationship with her mother, who died 20 years later. By the time she was in her 50s, Dani was married with a son, when one evening her husband casually suggested they send in saliva samples to one of the genetic testing companies. Thinking back, she must have had a sense.
I could have said no, and instead I said yes.
The results showed that her genetic profile did not match her parents' heritage. Then her half-sister got tested, and it turns out she and Dani were not related at all. At first, Dani thought the testing company got it wrong. But she did some additional sleuthing through family and medical records. They revealed that her parents conceived her with a sperm donor at the same clinic in Philadelphia where Lisa and Dee were conceived a few years later.
It was irrefutable, and it was also sort of staggeringly painful and destabilizing. Like literally, it felt like the room tilted, the floor tilted. Having believed something so fundamental and so intrinsically connected to identity all my life, and to find out that the stories that I had been told and the stories that I had told myself, which is what we base our identities on, was simply not true.
Of course, processing a whole new identity is hard enough. But then how do you process your feelings around the fact that a secret about you was kept from you by people you love?
I immediately thought to myself, like, wow, this is incredibly shocking, but it's also okay.
Michael Slepian is a Columbia University researcher who specializes in the psychology of secrets. We met him in episode 2. It was after he became an expert in secret keeping that he discovered its relevance to his own life. He was literally at the interview for his current professor job when he got an out-of-the-blue call from his father, telling him that Michael had been conceived by a donor.
I immediately thought about my friendships, my really close friendships, and how those aren't based in genetics. And so learning that my dad wasn't biologically related to me, that wasn't what shifted the ground underneath my feet. It was the secret keeping.
But at that point, they didn't talk about it. The topic was just too awkward. It was only when he started writing a book about secrets that he decided to ask them the most nagging questions. Who else knew? What about his grandparents? And why did his parents keep this information from him and his brother for so long?
You know, I think it brought us closer when I asked a bunch of questions about it years later. And it really made me realize that, you know, we still don't get all the benefits that come from having our secrets be out, which is we can talk about them.
But for many people, that's not possible. Since both Dani Shapiro's parents had died long before she took her genetic test, she couldn't ask them why they kept it all a secret. She had to process it without them. And after the initial shock, she made a conscious decision not to blame them. She understood that people make choices according to the norms of their era. Psychologists call this retrospective moral judgment.
I had to really think about what it meant to retrospectively, morally judge my parents for being people of their time. No one told their children. They were counseled by doctors who were considered gods. And so everyone in the medical establishment told parents of my parents' generation, it's better for the child not to know.
In other words, they truly believed that what you don't know can't hurt you. Better to sweep things under the rug. And yet,
we do know now there is no rug, and there is no broom, and secrets do seep into everything around them, and they do harm us even when we haven't, not even when we haven't, but especially when we haven't discovered them.
Like Dani, Lisa did not blame her parents for hiding her origin story, but she did want to process this with her mom. Her mom, however, was reticent to talk about it. She had promised not to, and she was also worried what people would think.
Eventually we got to this accommodation where I said to her, look, you made a pact with my dad, and I respect that. and you don't want your friends to know, and I respect that. But I didn't make that agreement. That agreement predated me. I had no opportunity to weigh in on it. And so I'm not going to keep the secret.
And so, even though Lisa describes herself as a private person, she went on a campaign of secret busting, telling all sorts of people her story, like coworkers or people she hardly knew.
Every time I talked to them about it, it became a little more real for me and a little more normal and a little less weird, you know? So it got to the point where I didn't feel like fainting every time I said it.
But she's conflicted about whether she wishes she knew all this earlier. She's not sure that would have helped her relationship with her dad.
Like, if I had found out as a teenager, I would have been like, right, you know, and it would have maybe fed the alienation a little bit more. Right now, what I'm left with is an overwhelming sense of gratitude to my father for doing something that was really kind of at the edge of what he could tolerate, like in terms of just being a really alien thing. He did it because he loved my mother and he wanted to make her happy, and they wanted to have kids.
Even so, Lisa believes that had her parents been honest with her, parts of her childhood could have been so much easier.
It would have normalized it. You know what I mean? Like, we would have had conflict over like how much time I was spending reading books versus hanging out with the kids in the neighborhood. But I wouldn't have felt like there was something wrong with me. I would have understood where it came from. It's so important for kids to know this so that they know that they're not broken when they're different.
As painful as discovering secrets can be, sometimes they change things for the better. Dee Gish's mother only lived for 3 more years after Dee learned how she was conceived, and they never discussed it. It was only decades later that, once genetic testing came around, Dee, like Lisa, also found out she had dozens of genetic half-siblings.
I was getting lots of email messages from half-siblings saying, hey, I bet you're curious to know who we are, and feel free to contact us when you're ready.
By then, a core group of the half-siblings had managed to track down the donor father, a businessman from Philadelphia, who, it turned out, was quite ill with a respiratory disease. They wrote him a letter, and he didn't respond. When he died, his family found that letter in his wallet. Lisa says she and her siblings don't know if he had read it.
And then a group of them went to his memorial service, incognito, just to find out information about him. Because at that point, we didn't know, did he have kids of his own? Would they talk to us? Would anybody talk to us?
For a time, they did connect with the children he raised and learned a few things about their common health history.
I mean, the biggest things are like dental. We all needed massive amounts of dental work, so we blame him.
But the man's family did not want a close relationship with the donor siblings, Lisa says. Nevertheless, both Lisa and Dee say that feels less important than the connections they've forged as this unconventional extended family.
Like, I would be standing in the supermarket checkout line and I'd look around and I'd be like, I don't even know how many half-siblings, I have these cool people that I've just met, and I have people I haven't met whose names I know, and I have people I don't even know about. And I feel really different.
The donor siblings still get together, visit each other in other states, have occasional dinners in small groups. Granted, Dee says it's weird to think she went decades not knowing that her siblings were potentially in her immediate orbit. She thinks there should be some sort of legislation to take into account the potential social complications from relatives created in fertility clinics. Could she have accidentally dated her brother?
I went to college at the same place as 2 of my half-sisters, and had they been males and we had gotten together because we have similar interests and traits and things like that, that could have been a problem.
Today, the group of Dee and Lisa's known siblings mostly interacts on a Facebook page. It has grown to at least 30 of them, and there are likely many more who haven't tested.
I've always been envious of people with big families and, loud Christmas dinners and, Thanksgiving get-togethers and things like that. I've always been envious of that, and now I kind of had the opportunity to maybe do that.
I wish I had known some of these people growing up, but it didn't happen, and I'm really blessed and delighted to know them now.
Dad, do you want to drink a little bit? It sounds like your mouth is a little dry.
You just get dry.
If you heard the first episode of this podcast, you've already heard from my father, Rex, who died in 2017. In that episode, I talked about the secret of my biological half-sister, Michelle, my father's daughter with a woman he met before he got married. I was in my 20s before I found out we were related. As my father was dying of pancreatic cancer, I taped some of our conversations.
What was it like for you all those years not being able to tell her that you were her real father?
It was bearable, you know. It was a plus to find out that I had a daughter, compared with not knowing that, and I would have liked it even more, for it to be an acknowledged relationship.
Rex did eventually get to acknowledge he was Michelle's father, and they became close. But there was another big secret in my father's life, namely who his actual father was. Rex was raised by a doting mother, Diane, and a man named Leon, whom he believed was his father. Their relationship was very strained. Leon was mean and belittling and unreasonably demanding.
Because whatever I did was never good enough. I mean, so that if I came third in my class, he'd say, well, what went wrong? Why weren't you first?
Rex was a very sensitive kid and often fantasized about having a much warmer, empathetic dad.
I have a mental image of an untidy, relaxed, but affectionate father.
What was he wearing in your fantasies?
Oh, he was wearing a grey polo-necked sweater and crumpled grey slacks. And he was in some way bumbling in a way that attracted affection rather than disdain. He was just a gentle, supportive presence.
By the way, this pretty much describes Rex himself after he became a father to me and my 3 sisters. Anyway, when Rex was about 50, his mother Diane told him that, in fact, Leon wasn't his real father, and that she had gotten pregnant by another man in the 1930s. All she knew was his name and that he was a doctoral student. This was many years before genetic testing became commonplace, so my father just resigned himself to not knowing the mystery of where or who his real father was.
It really dawned on me that there was a mystery to be solved here. But as I say, I didn't have this overriding compulsion to sort it out.
Then, shortly before my father died, my sisters and I decided it was time to uncover the secret of his origins. We thought this revelation would cap my father's life and give him a sense of closure. We hired a genealogical researcher who managed to track down the man's family. My sisters and I were beyond excited. But strangely, my father, weak from the cancer, seemed nonplussed.
I really was weirdly unmoved by the issue. You know, I don't know if it was suppressing something.
Do you think that part of that is because by the time you kind of learned all of this, even if you found this person, even if he was still alive, he wasn't going to be your father, like that ship had sailed?
Yes, that's certainly the case.
In the end, although we thought we found his family of origin, the genetic testing was inconclusive. So my father died, never knowing for sure. But he also told us he was at peace with that.
There was not much to be gained by expanding my near family, partly because I was so happy with that family that there was no room for improvement.
Today, many parents who have kept their children's origins a secret ask writer Dani Shapiro for advice. Since she's been so public with her own story, what has she learned that would help others know what to do?
I wanted to come up with something that I could say that would always be true. And what I finally arrived at was, they're going to find out. So do what you want with that. But I am here to tell you my parents were gone, and I found out without anybody to ask, and left holding a mystery. And that was upsetting and felt like a betrayal and felt infuriating, but mostly felt like I'm never gonna really know.
As a podcast host, her show Family Secrets is in its 6th year. Dani has talked with dozens and dozens of people about their moments of discovery and the fallout. Their secrets include affairs and second families and hidden siblings, suicides and mental illness, and all manners of topics considered in some ways, perhaps misguided ones, to be shameful. And when it comes to how much that discovery bifurcates one's life, for better or worse, a lot hangs on the timing of secret telling. Dani says she's actually glad she was in middle age, feeling settled both professionally and personally when she learned about her sperm donor. But in some cases, it feels like the opposite is true.
I was contacted recently by a woman in her mid-80s who wrote to me, who just found out, that I believe in her case that she had been adopted and never been told. To me, that's heartbreaking. There's no time, really, for a lot of processing. There's no one left to process it with. There's really very little to do with it other than to think I was wrong about my origins for my entire life. So that's an example of too late, perhaps.
And in some cases, like my father's, by the time the secret comes out, it just doesn't matter anymore. Life had adjusted to the reality you thought you had. These days, people may be less likely to hide fertility or adoption stories. Society has, to some degree, lessened the shame and stigma around them. But I do wonder, what are the things people keep to themselves today that may not come out for another 20 or 30 years? Things we consider so private they may not even feel like secrets. For example, there's still a hush around sudden and painful deaths from suicide or a drug overdose.
There's something that's absolutely sort of primitive in our nature, that we don't want to show weakness. And yet, the paradox is that when we do, and we discover that it's not seen as weakness, that's where true strength happens. Oh, this happened in another family? This is what it is to be a human being, is to go through these things, and if we can give voice to them, then it just makes all of that shame evaporate.
Dani recently wrote a novel, Signal Fires, that revolves around a fatal car accident, the truth of which is kept secret for decades. That kind of secret carries understandable shame. There was a potential crime involved. Someone died. It caused great suffering.
But everything that we're talking about is not that. Putting up a child for adoption is not a terrible thing that should cause shame. Using assisted reproduction and your child not being biologically related to you is not a terrible thing that should cause shame. I think shame also, and secrecy also, kind of tumble down through generations in a family. Somebody at some point has to be the one who breaks that cycle, otherwise it keeps happening.
Which is exactly what Dani and Lisa and Dee are hoping to do. Break the cycle by breaking open their family secret, so future generations will have the truth. You've been listening to The Secrets We Keep, a podcast about the stories we don't tell, what they say about our world, and what they do to our minds. It's a production of NEPM, written and reported by me, Karen Brown, edited by Sam Hudzik, with music by Katie Semro. For our next and final episode, The Secrets We Keep about the money we earn, who benefits from those secrets, and who is hurt.
Because if you don't know exactly what your colleagues are making on both sides of the color line, then you don't know what to ask for.
Envy isn't that one of the 7 deadly sins?
Are you willing to tell me how much money you make?
That's next on The Secrets We Keep. Thank you for listening. Got a secret or story you'd like to get off your chest? Email me confidentially at secrets@nepm.org. And just a reminder, NEPM is listener-supported, and podcasts like The Secrets We Keep rely on contributions from people who value this kind of programming. Please consider a donation by going to nepm.org or call 800-639-8850. Thank you for listening.